When his neighbor built a fence on his land and the HOA fined him for removing it, Mark knew this wasn't just a mistake. It was a calculated attack. Confident in his untouchable position, the neighbor even called the police, unaware that Mark had the evidence to turn everything upside down. What happened next left the entire community stunned, but let's start from the beginning. Mark Davis, a retired engineer with a knack for fixing everything from leaky faucets to squeaky doors, loved nothing more than the peaceful rhythm of his life. His home, nestled at the edge of a small, quiet town, was his sanctuary. The house wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was a legacy passed down from his parents. But what made it truly special was the land surrounding it. His backyard, with its century-old oak and perfectly tended garden, was his pride and joy, a place where he could sit, sip his morning coffee, and feel the world slow down. On a crisp Saturday morning, Mark stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, ready to enjoy the tranquility of the weekend. But instead of birdsong, he was greeted by a harsh, clanging sound. Puzzled, he walked toward the edge of his property, only to freeze in disbelief. His neighbor, Mr. Erickson, was hammering posts into the ground, erecting a fence that clearly cut into Mark's land. At first, Mark thought it was some kind of mistake. Surely, Erickson wouldn't just take it upon himself to claim part of his yard. Approaching calmly, he called out, "Morning, Erickson. What's going on here?" Erickson, wiping sweat off his brow, didn't even pause. "Oh, morning, Mark. Just putting up a fence to mark the real property lines," he replied, his tone casual, almost dismissive. Mark felt his stomach drop. "Real property lines?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Erickson finally turned to face him, holding a rolled-up piece of paper. "Yup, got these updated documents here. Your old ones are outdated. I'm just fixing things." Erickson's tone was clipped, as if he was doing Mark a favor. Mark felt his pulse quicken. Outdated. His parents had owned this land for decades. He had the original deed, maps, and survey records to prove it. The nerve of someone to make such a bold move without even discussing it. "Let me take a look at those papers," Mark said, his voice firm but controlled. Erickson hesitated, his fingers tightening around the documents. "Sorry, Mark. This is already decided. You might want to double-check your own records if you think something's wrong." And with that, Erickson turned back to hammering, ignoring Mark completely. Mark's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of the situation. He turned and walked back to his house, his mind racing. Inside, he rummaged through old drawers and filing cabinets until he found the thick envelope containing the property deed and survey. Spread out on his dining table, the papers told a clear story. The fence was definitely over the line. But the more he thought about Erickson's smug attitude, the more Mark felt an underlying unease. Erickson's confidence wasn't just arrogance, it was calculated. There was something else at play here, and Mark was determined to get to the bottom of it. He called up a local land surveyor to confirm his suspicions. As he waited for the surveyor's visit, Mark couldn't help but glance out the window at the partially built fence. Each post felt like a slap in the face. "Who does something like this?" Mark muttered under his breath. It wasn't just about the land, it was about respect. Erickson had crossed a line, and not just literally. Mark knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. After a restless night, Mark decided he couldn't let this go. The next morning, he called a local surveyor, someone with a reputation for precision and fairness. The surveyor, a meticulous man named Mr. Collins, arrived with his tools and a quiet determination. Together, they walked the perimeter of Mark's property, carefully measuring every inch. It didn't take long for the results to come in. The fence was undeniably 2 meters inside Mark's land. It wasn't just an encroachment, it was a blatant overstep. Mark felt a surge of both relief and frustration. Relief that his instincts had been right, but frustration at the audacity of Erickson's actions. With the new evidence in hand, Mark approached his neighbor once more, hoping to resolve the matter amicably. Erickson was outside, watering his lawn as if nothing had happened. Mark cleared his throat and spoke firmly but politely. "Erickson, the survey confirms it. The fence is on my property. I'd like us to sort this out before it escalates." Erickson barely looked up, his expression calm, almost smug. "Sort it out? I've already sorted it, Mark. If you've got a problem, take it to court. he said, his tone dripping with indifference. Then, as if to emphasize his point, he turned his back and continued with his hose. Mark stood there, stunned. The sheer arrogance was infuriating, but he wasn't the type to lash out or cause a scene. Instead, he walked back to his home, his mind racing. Erickson's attitude wasn't just dismissive, it was calculated, as if he knew something Mark didn't. That thought unsettled him. The next day, Mark received a letter from the HOA. It was a formal notice stating that his property lines were improperly documented and suggesting that the fence Erickson had installed was in compliance with their updated maps. Mark stared at the letter, his hands trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. How could the HOA take Erickson's side without even consulting him? Something wasn't right. Mark's suspicions deepened. Erickson's confidence, coupled with the HOA's sudden involvement, felt orchestrated. It was as if they were working together to strong-arm him into accepting the new boundary. But Mark wasn't about to back down. If anything, the challenge only strengthened his resolve. He decided to gather every shred of evidence he could. Over the next week, Mark became a man on a mission. He dug through old boxes in his attic, pulling out faded photographs that clearly showed the original boundaries of his yard. He called a friend who had a drone and recorded aerial footage of the property, highlighting the encroachment. He even managed to locate a retired neighbor who had lived in the area for decades and remembered the original layout. As Mark compiled his evidence, he couldn't help but feel the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, a retired engineer, spending his days documenting every blade of grass on his land, all because of a neighbor's greed. But he also felt a growing determination. This wasn't just about the fence, it was about standing up for what was right. By the end of the week, Mark had a solid case. His kitchen table was covered in documents, photographs, and maps. But what really stood out were the aerial images. They left no room for doubt. The fence was on his land, and anyone with eyes could see it. Despite the absurdity, Mark felt a flicker of hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, especially with the HOA siding against him. But he also knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone in this fight. With evidence in hand and a clear sense of purpose, Mark was ready for the next step. The battle was far from over, but Mark was determined to see it through. Mark had reached his limit. The sight of the invasive fence standing tall on his land felt like a daily insult, a blatant challenge to his rights. Early one morning, armed with his trusty toolbox and a resolve as firm as the oak tree in his backyard, he decided to take action. With deliberate precision, Mark began dismantling the part of the fence that encroached on his property. Each removed panel felt like reclaiming a piece of his dignity. But, as expected, Erickson didn't take kindly to Mark's assertion of ownership. Within an hour, a police car rolled up to Mark's driveway, lights flashing. Mark sighed deeply, setting down his tools as two officers approached him. Erickson stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression a mix of triumph and indignation. "This man is destroying my property," Erickson exclaimed, his voice loud enough to alert the neighborhood. Mark, calm but resolute, stepped forward and addressed the officers. "Gentlemen, I have documentation proving that this fence is illegally placed on my land. If you'll allow me, I can show you everything." The officers, to their credit, maintained their professionalism, asking both men to present their evidence. Mark led them into his home, where his dining table was still covered in maps, photos, and survey results. The officers reviewed the materials carefully, their expressions gradually shifting from skepticism to understanding. Meanwhile, Erickson hovered outside, pacing. When questioned, he could only mumble vague justifications, waving the same incomplete document that had been his supposed trump card. It quickly became clear that Erickson's claims were flimsy at best. His confidence began to falter, and Mark couldn't help but notice the beads of sweat forming on his neighbor's brow. After nearly an hour of discussion and review, the officers concluded that the situation was, at its core, a civil dispute rather than a criminal matter. But their parting words to Erickson were telling. "You might want to get your facts straight before you call us next time." Erickson's face flushed with embarrassment as the officers drove away. Mark felt a momentary sense of victory, but it was short-lived. The very next day, a letter from the HOA arrived in his mailbox. It was a formal notice of a fine issued for destruction of communal property. Mark couldn't believe his eyes. Communal property? The fence wasn't even approved by the HOA. Frustration bubbled up inside him as he realized that Erickson and the HOA seemed to be working together in some kind of coordinated effort to intimidate him. But then, a breakthrough. During a conversation with a neighbor, Mark learned something shocking. Erickson had installed the fence without proper HOA approval. It was a rogue project, entirely unauthorized. Armed with this information, Mark saw an opportunity to turn the tables. He reached out to the local press, sharing his story and the evidence he had painstakingly gathered. Within days, a reporter visited Mark's home, capturing the story of a quiet, principled man standing up against blatant injustice. The photos of the fence, the survey documents, and even footage of the police visit painted a vivid picture of the absurdity Mark had endured. The story gained traction, sparking outrage among the community. Other residents began to question the HOA's motives and Erickson's actions. The fence that had been a symbol of conflict was now the focal point of a growing movement for accountability and fairness. Mark, once a reluctant participant in the drama, found himself becoming the voice of reason and resilience. With the community rallying behind him and the press shedding light on the situation, Mark knew the tide was finally turning in his favor. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers filled every available seat, their hushed conversations creating a low buzz of anticipation. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, his documents neatly stacked before him, a symbol of the long weeks he'd spent preparing for this moment. Beside him, his attorney, a calm and confident woman named Linda Hayes, reviewed her notes one last time. Across the room, Erickson looked far less composed. His gaze darted around the courtroom, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were his last lifeline. The judge, a stern but fair figure, entered the room, and the atmosphere shifted. Silence fell as everyone rose, then sat. The proceedings began. Linda wasted no time presenting the evidence. She started with the surveyor's report, which clearly showed the fence's encroachment onto Mark's land. Next came the aerial photographs, highlighting the exact dimensions of the violation. But it was when she produced Erickson's forged documents that the courtroom collectively leaned in. These so-called updated property lines, Linda explained, holding up a copy of the document, are not only inaccurate, but also fraudulent. The original deed and official county records directly contradict this document. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. And as we will show, these forgeries were used to manipulate the HOA into supporting Mr. Erickson's claims. The judge raised an eyebrow, his interest clearly piqued. Erickson's attorney scrambled to object, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses took the stand, including the surveyor and even a few HOA members, who admitted under oath that they had been misled by Erickson's false claims. The room grew tense as more details emerged, each revelation painting Erickson in an increasingly damning light. But the most shocking moment came when Linda introduced emails obtained through discovery. These messages revealed a cozy relationship between Erickson and the HOA chairperson, Miss Gleason. The emails detailed their plans to redefine property lines and silence any opposition. "It's clear," Linda declared, her voice steady but sharp, that this was a coordinated effort to strip Mr. Davis of his rights for personal gain. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge's normally stoic expression betrayed a flicker of disapproval. Erickson's face had gone pale, and Miss Gleason, seated in the audience, looked like she wanted to disappear. When it was Erickson's turn to testify, his composure completely unraveled. He stammered through his answers, contradicting himself multiple times. His once confident demeanor was replaced by visible panic, and by the end of his testimony, it was clear that even he knew the game was up. The judge didn't take long to deliberate. His verdict was as decisive as it was scathing. "Mr. Erickson," he began, his voice firm, "your actions were not only unethical, but illegal. You deliberately falsified documents, misled a homeowners association, and caused significant harm to Mr. Davis. This court orders you to remove the fence at your expense and pay restitution for the damages incurred, including legal fees and the costs of professional surveys." The judge then turned his attention to the HOA. "As for the association, your complicity in this matter is deeply troubling. While you may not have initiated these actions, your failure to verify claims and your willingness to side with falsehoods have undermined the trust of your community. This court recommends a formal review of your practices, and I am issuing a warning to ensure no such actions occur in the future." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. The fight had been exhausting, but hearing those words made every sleepless night and moment of frustration worth it. As he left the courtroom, reporters swarmed him, microphones and cameras thrust in his direction. "Mr. Davis, how do you feel about today's ruling?" one asked. Mark paused, then smiled. "I feel like justice was served, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been pushed around by people who think they're above the law." The story made headlines, and in the days that followed, the HOA announced sweeping reforms, including the resignation of Miss Gleason. Erickson, meanwhile, was left to deal with the financial and social fallout of his actions. For Mark, the victory wasn't just about reclaiming his land, it was about standing up for what was right. And as he looked out over his now fence-free yard, he felt a renewed sense of peace, knowing he had done exactly that. The sun rose gently over Mark's neighborhood, casting a warm, golden light on the freshly restored boundaries of his property. The controversial fence, which had once stood as a symbol of arrogance and deceit, was now gone, reduced to a pile of neatly stacked wood ready for recycling. The air felt lighter, almost as if the entire community could finally exhale after weeks of tension. Erickson's departure was swift and quiet. After the court's ruling, he had little choice but to sell his home and move elsewhere. The moving truck pulled out early one morning, leaving behind a neighborhood that seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Mark watched from his kitchen window, his coffee steaming in his hands. There was no gloating, no sense of victory over Erickson, just a quiet satisfaction that the truth had prevailed. Not long after, the HOA held a special meeting to address the fallout. With Erickson gone and the scandal exposed, the chairperson, Miss Gleason, had stepped down, her resignation accompanied by a formal apology. Her replacement, a younger and seemingly earnest man named Daniel Harper, reached out to Mark personally. "I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA," Daniel said, standing at Mark's front door one crisp afternoon. His voice was steady, but his expression carried the weight of the HOA's tarnished reputation. "What happened to you should never have been allowed, and I promise to ensure nothing like this happens again." Mark, ever the gracious host, invited Daniel inside. They talked for over an hour, discussing not only the changes needed within the HOA, but also how the neighborhood could rebuild its sense of trust and community. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a glimmer of hope that this chapter of his life was finally closing. Meanwhile, the story had taken on a life of its own. The local news had picked it up first, framing Mark as a quiet hero who had stood his ground against both an overreaching neighbor and a complicit organization. Soon, larger outlets caught wind of the tale, and before long, Mark's story was being shared across the country. "Man stands up for his property and wins" became a rallying cry for countless others facing similar battles. Letters and emails poured in, many from people thanking Mark for inspiring them to fight for their own rights. For Mark, the media attention was both humbling and surreal. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but he embraced the opportunity to advocate for fairness and accountability. His story became a beacon, a reminder that even ordinary people could make a difference when armed with the truth and determination. Back at home, life began to return to its peaceful rhythm. Mark spent an afternoon planting new flowers along the edge of his yard, the scent of fresh soil and blooming petals filling the air. As he worked, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The fight had been long and draining, but the result was worth every moment of struggle. His land, his legacy, was safe once again. That evening, as Mark sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea, he looked out over his property with a deep sense of pride. The oak tree, the garden, the open space, it all felt more precious now, a testament to what he had fought to protect. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Mark thought about the countless others out there facing similar battles. If his story could inspire even one person to stand up for what's right, then every challenge, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had been worth it. This wasn't just about a piece of land, it was about justice, resilience, and the enduring power of doing what's right. Mark smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you've done something truly meaningful. The fight was over, but its impact would last a lifetime.